Today we're going to be talking about macroevolution. We watched already a video on microevolution. I'll just run through those real quickly. So micro meaning small, right? So there was five, the different fingers on your hand represent the different parts of microevolution. So we'll start with the pinky. So the pinky represented small populations for something called genetic drift, right? So the smaller the population, the more likely randomness is going to come into effect. All right, the ring finger represents mate choice, marriage, right? So if certain species have preference for their mates, that's going to shift the population much more so than, say, an asexual reproducing population that doesn't have mates, they just divide, right? If certain colors are favored, that's going to shift the population to a certain direction, okay? Middle finger representing M for mutation, and that adds randomness to the population. So the species that is more prone to mutation is going to have more variation in their population. Now remember, most mutations are bad news, but every once in a while you get a good one that could potentially help the species. The index finger should remind you of pointing and movement for migration. So if new species are coming and going, or new individuals in the species are coming and going quite a bit, then that's going to, again, add or take away variation to the population. And then finally, the thumb should remind you of our opposable nature, and that should remind you of natural selection. All right, natural selection is what we've already talked about. The best fit survive in their specific environment, and they reproduce and pass their genes to the next generation. So I'm recapping all of those microevolution ideas because all of those microevolution small changes can lead to really large ones in macroevolution. Okay, so real actual changes, speciation, thing that actually causes one species eventually to become two over many, many, many generations and thousands of years. And it's going to happen a lot faster for those species that have very short reproductive cycles. All right, species that take 20, 30 years to produce offspring, it's going to take a longer time for those microevolution changes to add up, which is going to take a longer time for the macroevolution, the larger changes to take place. Okay, so that's a quick recap of how microevolution works and how it feeds into macroevolution. So they work in tandem. Okay. All right, so the first is convergent evolution. There's a separate video I'll have you guys watch on this one, so I'll just run through this real quick. It's also, another example is called analogous structures. We've talked about these already as well. That's like the butterfly wing and the bird wing, right? They both can fly. They did not get the trait for flying for wings from the common ancestor. It was developed separately, two parallel lines of ancestry. You could also think about like beetles digging into the ground versus groundhogs, right? They both dig into the ground, but again, they didn't get that from a common ancestor. It was developed separately. The second is coevolution. So think of a lion and a zebra. All right, they're both trying to survive. Obviously, we know the lion's trying to eat the zebra, and the zebra is just trying to stay alive, right? So they are not working as a team to try and evolve together, right? Typically, we think of coevolution or co as cooperation or co-captains, co-managers for us office fans out there. So coevolution is not implying that the two species have to work together. It's just implying that they are affecting how each species develops. So in the case of the lion and the zebra is trying to run faster away from the lion. The faster lions are going to be the ones that survive because they eat the prey and pass on their genes to the next generation. Okay, it's more complicated than that, but that's kind of a simple example, right? The faster the zebra, the faster the lion needs to be in order to survive and reproduce. So number 3 is adaptive radiation. So this has to do with the Galapagos finches. So Darwin, what he's kind of mainly known for is visiting this island off of the west coast of South America. There's a bunch of islands that have very interesting species there. And the finches are these different types of birds. They're based off of one species that initially came to that island, to this main island. And then what happened was they started to spread out, going to different islands. And on these different islands, they had different food sources. Some had more insects, some had larger, harder seeds, some had smaller seeds, some had a mix of those things. So what happened was, as that population spread out to those different islands with their different food sources, the ones that had the beaks that were best fit for their island, that had that variation for the best beak for that island, survived, as we know, and passed on their traits to the next generation. And so what happened was all of these different islands, these birds, kind of stayed separate for the most part, and they continued to eat the food source on their island and pass their genes on the next generation. And so what he found was there was a commonality between all the species of the birds on these different islands. However, there was these very specific differences that led to their survival. And so you had eventually they started to become subspecies and different species around that island that had different beak shapes amongst other traits. We were really focusing on the beaks. That eventually led to enough difference between them for them to become different populations. So these first three are talking about what can happen when those microevolution changes build up over time and how a species can slowly change, right, and potentially turn into multiple species. Again, separate video on speciation to watch later. So these ones over here are talking about, the first two are actually different ways about thinking about how a species changes over many generations. So the first is the more commonly accepted one about how species actually change. It's thought to be more gradual in that the species will slowly change over time to best fit its environment. And the ones that are not best fit will die off, and potentially they separate based on geographic location and slowly build up changes over time until eventually you have these smooth transition between species, right? You should see intermediate species between two of them. So that's kind of the more common accepted idea about how species change. The one that's a little less common, there's less evidence for, is called punctuated equilibrium. And this is suggesting that species actually change relatively quickly, and that it's just a small couple of changes over a short period of time, a couple hundred years or so, and you see a brand new species. All right, so that's why there's little jumps here in the evolution of that species. All right, again, less evidence for it, not as common, but there are some species that are more prone to punctuated equilibrium because of their short lifespan. So it can actually happen. These changes can build up pretty quick. And then the last one is actually what happens when a species is going through macroevolution, but it's either not fast enough or the changes that are accumulating in the species are not beneficial to help the species survive. And so ultimately the species can come to an end. The other reason for extinction could be natural disasters and things like that. Mass extinctions, we've actually talked about it in previous courses, can kill off some species. So no fault of their own, right? Obviously they can't adapt to a situation that's a huge fiery situation coming at them. They're done for. But extinction that's not caused from natural disasters could be caused due to the species not adapting to their environment quickly enough. So the microevolution changes are not adding up and helping to allow the species to survive. Or invasive species could be coming in and taking over their niche and wiping them out. So many different reasons for extinction to occur, but ultimately that is the end to a lot of species that existed on this planet that are no longer around today. They didn't adapt to their environment quickly enough and died off. And remember, species don't hope for mutations or variation or hope for a trait, right? As we mentioned with the birds over here, the finches, the birds weren't thinking, oh, my beak is too small, I need to change my beak size to eat these larger seeds, right? That's not how species work. You're either fit for the environment or you're not. And if you are, then you survive, reproduce, and pass on your genes. If you don't, you either try to go somewhere else or you die off. Okay, so it's not by desire, right? And it's not by acquired traits like we talked about with Lamarck. It's instead just by the species being best fit based on their mutations or their variation that already existed within their genome. Okay, so that wraps up macroevolution, the larger changes.